Hittite Warrior by Joanne Williamson, Chapter 14. The Betrayal. Samuel and I had been invited to eat in the tent of Deborah that night. Leah and Tamar were there too, but I neither looked at nor spoke to Tamar. I felt bitter even against her. Deborah brewed her tea and passed it around in little bowls. She chatted with Leah like any other woman, of wonderful linens from Egypt and camphors from the east for keeping moths out of the wool, and the latest hairstyles of the women of fashion in Babylon. After a little of this, I began to shift about rudely on my goatskin rug, and finally yawned loudly in the middle of a remark about the new shops in the town of Shiloh. There was an embarrassed silence. People were not supposed to yawn at Deborah. But Deborah was not angry. "It is hard," she said, "for young men when the older men are away at council, and there is nothing for them to listen to but the gossip of women. We will talk of other things." And she began to tell us the story of a great battle of long ago in Egypt, when the finest army of Pharaoh had massed on the borders of the two lands to keep out a scattered and savage band of invaders. "And which army do you think was destroyed?" she asked. "I can tell you that," I replied, eager to show off what I had learned from the books in Tyre. "It was the army of Pharaoh, for Egypt had no horses in those days, and the invaders had gotten them from our people, the Hittites of the north." And I thought, if the finest army of Pharaoh could not stand against chariots, what could a half-armed mustering of Hebrew shepherds do against the chariots of Canaan? Samuel was thinking the same thing, and he gave me an angry look. "If the Lord had been on Egypt's side," he said, "she would have had no need of chariots." "Well, what would you have done?" said Deborah, looking straight at me. Why, I stammered, and then I collected my thoughts and spoke more surely. "If I had been the captain of Pharaoh's hosts, I would have taken my men into the hills." Samuel snorted. "Wise man, there are no hills in Egypt." "Well, there are hills here," I said, forgetting that I was not supposed to know what we were really talking about. Samuel had forgotten too, and in his eagerness he blurted out, "And do you think that Sisera is a fool who will risk his horses on rough ground?" Sisera, the name that I had forgotten for so long, hit me like a blow between the eyes. Sisera. A man named Sisera. He will help you for my sake. I could feel the blood rush from my head, leaving me dizzy. Who, I began, and then I managed to finish. "Who is Sisera?" Samuel now gave Deborah an uneasy look, realizing that he had said more than he meant. Deborah was silent a moment and then sighed. "Our young friend is not a fool," she said. "I do not think we have hidden much from him. Sisera is the chief of Harosheth," she added quietly. "He who is the captain of all the host of Canaan when they joined together in battle. Have you never heard his name? They frighten children with him here in the hills. His hand is heavy as iron upon all of inland Canaan, and his evil city swallows its victims as a serpent swallows small animals, and even the Canaanites fear him. But he is a great warrior who went to Carchemish in his youth and learned from the Hittites the arts of war and horses and chariot fighting." This was the same man. My father too had been sent to the Hittite city of Carchemish in Armor to learn of horses and chariots, for there were great teachers there. Once when I was little, he had told me of a young Canaanite prince whom he had known there, whose life he had saved when a horse broke and ran with him, and with whom he had sworn friendship. But I had forgotten that story. "What is the matter with you?" Samuel was saying, for I was not able to sit still, but I had gotten up and walked about the tent. I mumbled an excuse, and I sat down, staring at the fire-lit faces. Sisera was the chief of Harosheth? Sisera was the captain of the host of Canaan? Sisera was my father's sworn friend. These people were his enemies, and I sat among them and ate their bread. This was what had come of my breaking my promise to my father and blaspheming against Moloch. The gods had punished me indeed. "Are you sick, child?" Deborah asked me, and she said it so like a mother that I wanted to cry, for I already knew the treachery that I was going to commit. That night I told the others that it was lack of air within the tent that made me faint, and that I would sleep at the door of the tent. And lying under the stars, I thought of what I must do. I had taken the hospitality of the Hebrews and eaten food in their tents. To turn against them now would be a black betrayal, but to stay with them would be to break my promise to my dead father once and for all, and to set my hand against his friend, and that would be worse than any other treachery. Besides, I told myself, these people were not my friends. Jotham was gone without a word. Tamar had not stood behind me. And Samuel. The thought of Samuel, I knew that I had to do it. I unwound myself from my robe and I got up. The moon was still high. I crept to the tent door, listened and peered in, and made sure that the others were asleep. Some moonlight from the entrance had fallen across the face of the sleeping Jabin. His mouth was a little open, and his cheeks were flushed. Blasphemy or no blasphemy, I was glad I had helped to save him from Moloch. I wished that I could say goodbye to Jotham, and when I thought of Tamar, I almost wavered, but I did not. There were skins in the yard and water in the well, and I supplied myself with what I would need to drink on a day's journey. I stole some cheese, too, from the tents, and some bread. I had no time to lose, and gathering up my supplies and setting my course by the stars, I ran from the tents, heading towards Harosheth. Chapter 15. How I came to Harosheth. The night air was cold, and I moved as fast as I could. I knew that Harosheth was somewhere to the southwest of Hushai ben Aaron's tents, but I was not sure how far, and I did not dare to follow the highway. I seemed to be traveling a long way. The first light of morning was in the east, when to my great surprise, I heard my name called from a far-off rise in the ground. 3 travelers were coming toward me. When I saw who they were, I felt a chill, for they were Heber the Kenite and 2 of his shepherds. There was a strange, sly smile on the face of Heber when he reached me, and his shepherds stood back, watching me with cold, curious eyes. "You are far from the tents of Hushai," he said to me. "Surely my eyes do not deceive me, and your face is turned towards the city of Harosheth." I could not lie to him, and he smiled again. "I too have business in Harosheth," he said. He grinned suddenly. Better business than I had thought. He said that he would guide me. I did not want to travel with him, for I did not trust him. But his 2 shepherds were very strong, and I did not like the way they looked at me, so I did not want to insult him. One of them moved in an odd, furtive way, and suddenly I knew that he was the man I had seen in the dark the night I had spied outside the tent of Deborah. After we had walked a while, I said, "Surely this is not the way to Harosheth." "It is the way to the highway," said Heber the Kenite, "and the highway would take us there." "But it is dangerous on the highways in these times." "Dangerous for whom?" grinned Heber. "I have no fear of the Canaanite soldiers, though they did me a bad turn when they sold me my wife." I trusted him less than ever. Finally I stopped and said I would go no farther with him. "Look behind you," said Heber. I turned and saw the eyes of the 2 shepherds upon me with a look that made my blood run cold. I looked down from their eyes and saw that in their hands were their knives. I said no more, for now I knew I was the prisoner of Heber the Kenite, and I began to walk again. After a while, Heber went on talking. "No," he said, "I have no fear of the Canaanites. I have done them many a good turn and made many a good profit by it. No such good turn and no such good profit, though, as I will make today." I said to them, "You will do them a good turn if you take me to Sisera in Harosheth. He will reward you." Heber laughed. "You are right. My shepherds have had some talk with the servants of Hushai. They know that you ran away from Tyre of Canaanites, and they know why. Yes, the men of Harosheth will reward me well for you." "What are you going to do?" I asked him, but he did not reply, for we had come to the highway. The highways were not as busy as they had been when I first journeyed along them from the north, and I knew it was because there were rumors of trouble in the land. But a number of men passed by, and even a caravan, and still we sat by the side of the road without moving. The hands of the shepherds were always on their knives. "What are we waiting for?" I cried at last. "You will see," said Heber patiently. And at last I saw. A small squad of soldiers marched toward us from the south, and at the sight of them, Heber sprang to his feet. They were Canaanite soldiers, and they seemed to be guarding something of great value, carried among them in an ivory box. Heber went to them, waving his hand for them to stop. The captain gave the order for his men to halt and listened while Heber spoke to him in a low voice. I saw him stare at me in astonishment, make the sign against evil, and start toward me. But Heber stepped in front of him, holding out his hand. They bargained together for a few minutes, then the captain gave him some silver and pushed past him toward where the shepherds were guarding me. 2 of his men followed him. Then something happened that I never thought could happen to me. They pulled me to my feet and tied my hands behind me. They bound a rope around my neck, as I had seen one bound among the necks of the Naphalites. My heart jumped and pounded, and my tongue seemed to freeze with terror. "What are you doing?" I managed to cry out. "Why are you doing this to me?" "This man told us who you are," said the captain, pointing to Heber the Kenite. "You are the blasphemer who stole the sacrifice of Moloch in Tyre on the day of first fruits. Even here in the hills we have heard of this. The city of Harosheth will have 2 prizes today. We carry the image of Dagon, lord of earth and sea, a gift from the king of Gaza to guard our city in a time of trouble. Already Dagon has shown his favor, for it is Harosheth who will avenge the insult to the Lord of wrath." I stared at Heber the Kenite, still not believing what he had done to me. Then someone jerked at the rope around my neck. I stumbled and choked, and we began our journey to Harosheth. How I lived through the rest of that day I cannot remember, for when the rope did not choke me, the dust of the highway did, and though the sun tortured me, they gave me no water. I cannot remember my first sight of the dark walls of the city on a height above a river, surrounded by its huts and stone cottages. But it must have been an awesome sight, for Harosheth, though surely not so great a city as Sidon or Tyre, was the chief town in inland Canaan. It swallows its victims as serpents swallow small animals, Deborah had said, and I was one of the victims. But I remember being marched through the gate and seeing that the people were bigger and rougher than in Tyre, and some wore many more and bigger jewels and ornaments, but their clothes were fewer and coarser, and some wore next to nothing at all. There was only one long street and a marketplace, a threshing floor, and many alleys. There were no great buildings as there were in Tyre, except for one, which I took to be the great house of the king. The people stared at us and shrank back out of our way, and some of them spat at me, for they could see I was not a slave but a prisoner, a criminal of some kind. A beggar shouted something at me as we passed, and I think he put a curse on me, which frightened me more than ever. Father, I said to myself, I promised to come to Harosheth, but not like this. They took me to a prison, a dark underground place beneath a city wall. I was chained and given some water to drink, which I gulped down as though I had never had water before. Then they left me, and I thought that I had been afraid many times before. But now I knew that I had never known what fear was. It was dark, and the air was wet and evil-smelling, and I could hear the scratching and running of rats. A guard brought me some food that night. At least, I suppose it was night, for there was no light in any case. Listen, I said to him, you must help me. He did not answer. Can't you speak to me? I asked him, but he only shoved the bowl of meal over toward me, along the floor. Listen, I said again. Surely the lord of this city is a man called Sisera. When he did not answer, I said, you must go to him, or if you cannot go, you must have someone go for you. You must tell him that Uriah Tarhund, son of Arnadash the Hittite, is here. The man turned to go, and I shouted after him, Arnadash the Hittite, you must tell him that. He will reward you. But the man was gone. I had not seen his face, so I could not tell if he had even listened to me. And if he had, would he bother to speak? And if he did, could I really be sure that this great Lord Sisera was the man who was my father's friend? And what if he were not? I threw myself on the slimy, wet floor and cried from fear, for I was still very young. Chapter 16, the priest of Moloch. I cannot say how long they kept me in prison, except that it was long enough for me to get used to the rats. They fed me enough and they gave me enough water, but no one spoke to me. Sometimes, just for the sound of it, I talked aloud to myself. I even laughed aloud at the clever things I said. Then, when I stopped, all would be more silent than ever, except for the dank drip of water down a rock somewhere. The terror would come upon me, and then I would mumble frightened prayers to mighty Teshub, and even to Moloch. At last, for the first time, the keeper spoke to me. Come, he said. That was all. And I followed him with shaking knees, my chains dragging behind me. Some soldiers met us and took me from the keeper. They marched me through an underground way that twisted and turned, and finally up some dark, narrow stone steps, then so suddenly that I rubbed my eyes into the light. We were in a long chamber smelling of cedar wood from the northern forests. Through a window I could see outside a high pillar in honor of Shan, the sacred serpent. Nearby was a stone image of Astarte, the mother, with a dove at her breast and the serpent himself at her feet. I knew then where I was. I was in the chamber attached to the temple of the city god, where the town's council of elders held their meetings. There were benches on either side of the wall, on which sat the elders in heavy robes of Babylonian style, with curling, heavy, netted beards. In the center was a higher bench. 2 men sat upon it with another man, probably a temple scribe, squatting at their feet, holding a reed pen and papyrus. I stared at the 2 men. I could guess who they were. One was thin and anxious-looking, with quick, bright eyes and a stringing beard, who reminded me a little of Etebal. I suppose he was the chief elder. The other man frightened me. He sat quietly on the high bench, unlike the elder who was always turning his head, gesturing here and there and whispering to the scribe. He had a heavy jaw and a thin mouth. His eyes were small and close set, and when he looked at me, it was like an icy wind going through me. He was clean-shaven and dressed like a priest, and I knew, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that he was the high priest of Moloch in Harosheth. The guards stood before me on the high bench, and then moved aside. The temple scribe began to read from his tablet. A great crime has been committed against our Lord of wrath, and through him against all the land of Canaan. This year, in our sister city of Tyre, according to ancient custom, a sacrificial offering was dedicated to the Lord Moloch, of dreaded name, to appease his wrath. On the eve of the day of the first fruits, the offering was stolen, bringing down the wrath of the gods and all manner of evil upon the land of Canaan. If this prisoner has conspired in this crime, he is worthy of the punishment for blasphemy, which is this: to be taken to the place of execution by the gates of the city, and set upon with stones until he is dead. By our laws, 2 witnesses who will not deny each other must be brought forth. I ask leave of the Lord elder to call them. The elder gave his permission, and the first witness was called. He was one of the servants of Heber the Kenite. He is not a witness, I thought. He has never even been in Tyre. He could not have seen what happened. But it did not seem to matter too much. An insect was buzzing about the chamber, and I was watching it, shutting out of my mind what was going on around me and taking dreamy pleasure in the sunlight outside. Then I heard my name. I jumped. It was the priest of Moloch who had spoken. What have you to say, he asked of me, of what these honest men have told us? Have they spoken the truth? Part of it, I said, at last, feeling too confused, and tried to explain how much of it was true and how much was not. Then you admit your guilt, my son, he asked in a calm, kindly voice. But I knew he was determined that nothing should cheat his God and his city of their victim, and that there was no hope for me after all. The chief elder leaned toward him and began to whisper in his ear. Perhaps it was because I realized that nothing could save me, or it may have been a fresh breeze that happened to blow across the window and pass across my face. But suddenly I was no longer drowsy, and my thoughts began to clear. I watched the 2 men closely and began to pay careful attention. At last the chief elder turned back to me, smiling for the first time. My son, he said, you must look upon us as your friends. It is painful for us to see one so young accused of such a crime, and be forced to judge you so harshly. Remember, we are servants of the gods whom you worshipped in your own country. It is your duty to put your trust in us as you would your father, and tell us truthfully all we ask. I looked at him and said nothing. Is it your desire, said the elder, to redeem yourself in the eyes of Moloch, whom you have so gravely offended? Yes, my lord, I replied. It was never my wish to offend the gods. Then listen, said the elder. We know that you took the sacred child to the Hebrews, and that you have been among them since then. We have heard rumors that the Hebrews are conspiring among themselves and raising a rebellion against us. Do you know of these things? Yes, my lord. Then, said the elder, give thanks to Moloch, for he has shown you the way to cleanse yourself of your great blasphemy. Think back to what you heard of these things in the tents of the Hebrews. Cleanse your heart of them and tell us what you know. I stood staring at the 2 men on the high bench and thought of the dirty black image of Moloch as I had seen in the temple of Tyre. I thought of the tents of the Hebrews and Deborah and Tamar's hand on Jabin's shoulder and little Aphiah listening to the Red Sea song. A feeling that I could not understand came sweeping over me like the wind across the grasslands at home, and I wanted for some reason to laugh out loud. Answer the questions we will put to you now, said the high priest. His voice was harsh, not soft and coaxing like the elders. His eyes told me that redeeming myself in the eyes of Moloch did not mean saving myself from death under the stones. Tell us their numbers, tell us their tribes, tell us their plans. No, I said. I said it as my father had said it before to the captain of the sea people. There was silence for a moment, and then the high priest leaned toward me. His voice was soft and shaking with wrath. Then you are guilty of treason as well as blasphemy. Treason to what? I asked, looking at him scornfully, and with all the pride I could muster, I added, I am a Hittite. When I said that, there was a buzz of anger over the chamber, and the old hatred blazed into the eyes of all the counselors on their benches. I believe the elder would have liked to save me before, but not now, for there would always be hatred in the hearts of all ancient peoples for all their conquerors over the years. The high priest of Moloch rose to his feet, and his heavy face was pale. You are insolent, he said. Besides being a traitor and a blasphemer, do you know what happens of men? To men who will not give honest answers, we test them, and we test them in the ordeal by water. For a moment my head reeled. The ordeal was to be bound hand and foot, weighted down with stones, and cast into the water. The priest had always assured us that those who spoke falsely or withheld information would sink and perish, but those who spoke the truth would miraculously float. I feared water above all things, far above death by stoning. Will you give us honest answers to our questions? Asked the high priest. No, I said, my voice now shaking. The high priest turned to the guards, probably to tell them to take me to the river. But I will never know for sure, for there was a pounding on the heavy wooden door of the chamber, and a voice called from outside, Open for the Lord Sisera, Great One, captain of the host of Canaan, defender of the city of Harosheth.